Okay. A very good evening to everyone here from Mumbai. I'm Abhijit, a student mentor at Upgrad, and today's session on customer centricity will be taken up by Professor Ahmed Khwaja. Professor Ahmed is a member of faculty at Cambridge Judge Business School, and he'll be taking you through today's session. We are really sorry for the short delay. There was some technical difficulty, and because of the same, Professor won't be able to share his own video, whereas the slides and the videos otherwise will work completely fine. So that is it from my side. And yeah, over to you, Professor. Thank you so much, everyone.
Abhijit, just wanted to make sure that you can hear me and see the slides at this stage. Hello?
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay, all right. So let me know at any stage if you cannot see the slides or you cannot hear me. I'll also have a video to play, and a very warm welcome to all of you. It's about afternoon here in Cambridge. It's a mild fall afternoon on a Saturday. As I was walking into my office, I noticed that people are going about their business. It's a busy day. It's sort of that mild temperature, about 13 degrees or 55 or 56 Fahrenheit, depending on how you measure your temperature. I hope all of you are having a very nice day, wherever you might be, whether you are in the east or the west, the north, the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. Hope you've had a nice weekend so far, and I'm glad you could join us for this webinar. Unfortunately, we won't have video today. I apologize for that. Abhijit and I were in fact trying to work through a glitch. There's some sort of a glitch, and we don't have video, and we couldn't get it rectified, so we just decided we'd just go ahead without the video. But hopefully, you won't be able to see me, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me. You'll see the slides, and you'll see some videos I will play. So it's my pleasure, as I said, to be here with you today, and I'm going to talk about customer centricity. So this is a follow-up to some of the content you've already seen online, and I'm going to add to that in this webinar this afternoon here in Cambridge. So I will talk about three things, and when we talk about customer centricity, we're really talking about what people call customer empathy, or putting yourself in your customer's shoes. And as we all realize, that's often easier said than done. And so the question is, how do we actually do this? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll talk about three things. My agenda for the day is three things. I'll talk about a little bit about the value proposition, which is again an idea we're all familiar with, but I just want to clarify. I just want us to be all on the same page before we move forward with the rest of the webinar on what I really think about as a superior value proposition. I'll talk a little bit about customer focus, and then finally, I'll spend most of the time talking about the customer journey and its implications for marketing and business decisions. So the value proposition. We've all heard the phrase value proposition, but I think it's good to just take a minute. I'll just take a slide on this and just clarify what exactly we mean by a superior value proposition. So a superior value proposition requires one of two things. There are one of two necessary conditions that have to be met before a value proposition can be considered to be superior. The first potential condition is that a similar benefit is provided by you, your company, your firm, your organization, but at a lower cost than competitors. And I'll clarify what I mean by benefit and cost with an example. It's not necessarily just monetary values. Benefits and costs are not just things you can measure in currency, in monetary values. So it could be this necessary condition to have a superior value proposition, or alternatively, it could be that you provide a superior benefit, and that's your company's strength, but at the same cost as your competitors. And by competitors, I mean any potential substitute for whatever need it is that your value proposition intends to meet for your customers. So let's think of an example. Google, right? So about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, I remember I was a graduate student at that time, and I was trying to browse the web, and I was really frustrated because I was using search engines like Alta Vista and Yahoo and Lycos and AOL. And a friend of mine, I remember quite clearly, Tim said to me, you know, why don't you try something called Google? And this was back in the day when you couldn't even Google. It was a completely new product. And so I somehow found Google. I sort of searched, you know, whatever in Lycos or whatever I was using on Yahoo. I found Google and I used Google, and I was amazed by two things. One, I was amazed by the speed at which I got a response back. And two, I was amazed at how relevant that response was. So I didn't have to dig through pages and pages and pages before I found a relevant response to my query. And so Google, they were actually meeting both these conditions. They were providing a superior benefit. And if you think about, you know, what is the benefit a customer might be searching for in search, in online search? Well, it's finding a relevant response. So they were providing a superior benefit than their competitors, and their competitors with the other search engines. Actually, their competitors were an even wider set, right? So not everyone had internet at that time. So you could have thought, you know, how did people search? So people who had internet access or, you know, could find their way onto the web would be using search engines. But if you did not have internet access or you could not find your way onto the web, then you would be using the older methods of search. You might be looking at magazines or newspapers or books or journals or going into the library or talking to people, phoning people, you know, all those methods of search that still exist today, but have been made somewhat redundant because of online search. And so they were providing a superior benefit. That means they gave very relevant responses and at a lower cost. And what was the cost? The cost was time. It wasn't money. It was a free product. And so Google provided both a superior benefit and a lower cost than their competitors, right? Relevant responses and really quickly. And so Google, that's their basic value proposition. They're a company based on search. And I understand, you know, that it's not just Google, it's actually Alphabet now, and there's many, many things that they do, but they recognize, Google still recognizes that their bread and butter is online search. That's where their business model comes from. That's their basic business model. So on the order of about 1.5 times a day, they improve their search algorithm. They work every day on their search algorithm. Their search algorithm changes about 500 times a year, as my colleague, Professor Sasha Liu, when she talks about search in one of the later webinars, will tell you. Because they understand that's how they keep their competitive advantage. Their value proposition is to help consumers search better. And actually, search better means the superior value proposition is providing more meaningful responses, relevant responses to the queries, and doing it as fast as possible. That's the benefit and cost here. So I just wanted to clarify what we mean by a superior value proposition. It's got to be that it's got to meet one of these two conditions. If it doesn't meet one of these two conditions, it's not a superior value proposition. So if you're ever thinking about changing your customer strategy to improve your value proposition, always think, is my customer strategy going to improve the value proposition and create a superior value proposition by meeting one of these two conditions? If it meets both, that's great. You know, that's what Google is able to do. But you don't have to meet both. You can meet just one of these and create a superior value proposition. Right? So whenever you think about innovation or changing your customer strategy, always think about, am I actually going to create a superior value proposition? And from that, you will have a chance then to develop good marketing strategy in order to be able to create, communicate, and deliver value to your customers. This is really important because a lot of times the problem arises that people haven't thought through their value proposition and they're already sort of jumping ahead they're sort of putting the cart before the horse, and they're thinking about marketing strategy and everything else that comes from that. Whereas their value proposition is really not a superior value proposition. And if that's the case, marketing really cannot help you. If you don't really create value for your customers, then you can do all the marketing that you want, but you're always going to have a challenge on your hands. It all starts with having a superior value proposition. And this happens with me very often. I'll have, my students walk into my office and say, Professor, can you help me with branding or positioning or, some sort of channel kind of question, and I'll be struggling with them for a little bit. Then I'll step back and I'll say, let's just think about this carefully. Tell me, what is your value proposition and how is it a superior value proposition? And that's where the wheels come off. That really, when we think about it carefully, it's not really a superior value proposition. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and just talk about this because everything flows from this. Okay. So having said this, let's now talk about customer focus. So just indulge me for another minute or so as I go through this diagram. Again, these are ideas that are familiar to all of you, but I just want to reiterate them and just clarify a few things. So typically, when we're thinking about a firm, we're thinking about a firm having customers. And as I just said, the purpose of a firm is to create, communicate, and deliver value to its customers. And in return, the firm extracts or captures back some of this value from the customers, which is its revenue, right? And then you can think about profits based on the costs it takes for the firm to create, communicate, and deliver the value. The difference between the revenue and the cost is the profits. And so typically what you want, and this is something we'll get into later in the course, is you want to create value for the customer that is more than the revenue that you extract back. And the reason you want to do this is because you want to be a long-term sustainable firm. You want to have a relationship with your customers. This is what CRM is, customer relationship management. That if you create more value than you extract back, then the customers have an incentive to keep coming back to you, and you have a relationship with them, and you become a long-run sustainable firm. Whereas if you extract more than you give them, the customers might try you one time or maybe even twice, but then after a certain number of attempts to work with you, they'll give up and they'll go somewhere else because you're actually extracting more from them than the value you're creating for them. So this is kind of obvious. The question really is, who determines value? So who determines the value in the value proposition? And so if we stop for a minute and think about that, the answer again is quite obvious. The answer is, it's the customer. And this is the reason we want to be customer focused. Another way to say this is, I'm the former CEO of a very large Fortune 500 company in the US, Home Depot, which is essentially a home improvement. It's a network of home improvement stores, do-it-yourself or hardware, home improvement stores. He used to say that the customer pays our salary. That's another way to say this. The reason we want to be customer focused, the reason everything in a business should begin with the customer is because the customer determines the value in our value proposition, not us. This is the myth that we think we determine the value in the value proposition. It's not us. It's not what we think the value proposition is. It's what the customer thinks what the value proposition is. Does it actually solve a need for them? Does it fill a need gap for them? Does it reduce their pain? Does it help them with a pain point? That's what determines the value in the value proposition, right? So the customer pays our salary, another way to say this. And that's why we want to be customer focused. That's why it's so important. So let me read you this quote from Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker passed away, but he was a big management guru. And he would say that the aim of marketing is to make selling superfluous. So this is an irony, but I want to say this, that I don't like talking about selling. Even though I teach courses in marketing, I don't like to talk about selling. And this is exactly this notion from Peter Drucker, that the aim of marketing is to make selling superfluous. You don't want to be selling. Marketing is to know and understand the customer so well that the product or service fits him or her and sells itself. Another way to say this is you want the customer to find the value in the value proposition. And if you can do that, then the product will sell itself. The customers will line up and demand more. You know, this is the reason there are customers who line up 2-3 nights before Apple launches a product, because they find value in the product. It's really pull. What you really want to create is a product, a value proposition that will be pulled by your customers rather than that you will have to push it. All the problems start when you have to start pushing. Okay. So, but what did Peter Drucker mean? So let's try and unpack this. In order to unpack this, let's actually look at a video. Let me try and play this video. I'm not going to try and play it in, I have this in my PowerPoint slides, but let me not play it through the PowerPoint slides because I know it freezes up. So let me just play this through a browser and hopefully you can see this. And while I set this up, so just give me a second, while I just set this up, let me just give you a little bit of background on this. So hopefully you can see this. Abhijit, let me know. Can you see the video? I'm not playing it as yet, but I just set it up onto the screen. I hope I'm sharing it.
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right. So let me just give you a little bit of background on what this video is about. So this is Steve Jobs. It's an old video, and so therefore the quality is not going to be that great. But this is Steve Jobs. And let me remind you, Steve Jobs got fired from Apple twice before he came back to create it into the icon that it was. And so this is in between one of those occasions when he got fired, and he's doing a town hall like Steve Jobs did. And this is a town hall for investors and fans of Apple. And there's a gentleman who's come up and asked a fair question, but he's asked it in a very rude way. Essentially, Apple at that stage was developing a product called Open Docs. And Steve Jobs has scrapped it. And so this person is asking, you know, why did you scrap Open Docs? That was going to be your next blockbuster product. And we typically think of Steve Jobs as a very arrogant and rude person. So see, his demeanor, how he responds, but also listen to what he says. And then we'll come back and think about Peter Drucker's quote and try and unpack that using some of the ideas that Steve Jobs lays out in his response to this person. Okay, so I'm going to play it now.
You know, you can please some of the people some of the time, but one of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things Open Doc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? And one of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that. And I think that's the right path to take. I remember with the laser writer, we built the world's first small laser printers, you know, and there was awesome technology in that box. We had the first Canon laser printing, cheap laser printing engine in the world in the United States here at Apple. We had a very wonderful printer controller that we designed. We had Adobe's PostScript software in there. We had AppleTalk in there. Just awesome technology in the box. And I remember seeing the first printout come out of it and just picking it up and looking at it and thinking, you know, we can sell this. Because you don't have to know anything about what's in that box. All we have to do is hold this up and go, do you want this? And if you can remember back to 1984, before laser printers, it was pretty startling to see that. People went, wow, yes. And that's where Apple's going.
Okay, let me bring it back now to the, let me bring it back to the slides. So just give me a second. Okay, so I hope you can see the slides. I hope you were able to see the video. And so if we just think back to what he was saying in the video, so one, he's talking about the fact that he's got the scar tissue to prove that very often he would start with the engineers and then, you know, try and see how he could sell the technology. And then he learned, as he said, you know, he had the scar tissue to prove this, as he learned from his mistakes. What you've got to start with is thinking about the customers, thinking about what is the experience you're trying to deliver to them, and then you come back and work with the engineers to try and see how you can deliver that experience. And then he gives the example of this dot matrix printer and the Apple laser printer. So some of you might remember this, but others may not. You know, so this is what dot matrix printers were like, and this is what their printing was like on the left-hand side of the slide as I look at it. And then after that came the laser printer. And it was the case that in the early days of printing with these dot matrix printers, this looked so unprofessional to an extent that oftentimes people would just prefer to write letters, you know, by hand. And now, of course, who does that? Because printing has improved to a state where you can get all kinds of fonts and you can even mimic your own handwriting, right? So it doesn't make sense for people to write unless they actually love to write by their own hand. And Steve Jobs says when they first created this laser printer at Apple, there was a lot of, as he uses words, there was awesome technology in that box. You know, there was Adobe's technology, there was Apple's technology. But he said the moment the first printout came out of that printer, he knew we could sell this because people would see the value in the output from a laser printer compared to the output from a dot matrix printer. And of course, you could talk about who could afford it and all that kind of stuff, you know, the pricing and all that. That would follow, you know, all the marketing would follow. But it would be easy, relatively easy to do the marketing because there'd be sufficient pull. You wouldn't have to push it because people would just see the value. You know, of course, people who could afford it, or, you know, you could create different versions of this. You could do versioning, you could have segments, you could have pricing in different segments. You could do all that kind of stuff. But that would follow because there'd be demand for it. There'd be demand because people would just see the value of this compared to the old way of printing, the substitute, the dot matrix printer, and just see how superior this value proposition was. And from that, everything would just follow, right? So again, this is Steve Jobs, you know, person we think of as who would say, you know, don't talk to your customers cannot tell you anything. You know, him flipping all this and saying, you know, actually, if you hear him in his own words, he's saying that you always start with the customers, right? Now, he's also right, you know, you might remind me, say, well, he also said, don't talk to your customers. Well, when you're doing really radical innovation, then you don't talk to your customers to ask them for solutions, but you actually still observe your customers. You still talk to your customers to figure out what their need gaps are, what their pain points are, and what experience they want. Maybe they cannot, sometimes they cannot even articulate it in words. And in that case, you actually just observe them. You do what is called ethnographic research. You just follow them, you observe them. But of course, certainly when you're doing more incremental or relatively incremental kind of innovation, then at that stage, you certainly want to be talking to your customers. So to come back now to Peter Drucker's words, what did Peter Drucker have in mind? When he says the aim of marketing is to make selling superfluous, marketing is to know and understand the customer so well that the product or service fits him or her and sells itself. This is the same thing that Steve Jobs is saying, that you really want to understand your customer. You want to be so up close to them. You want to understand them so well that you know their needs, you know their pains better than in fact they do. You even understand what they might want, even if they cannot articulate it. So the way I like to summarize this, everything that Steve Jobs said, one way to summarize this is to say, think outside in, not inside out. A lot of times, firms make the big mistake of thinking inside out. They begin with what they think are their core competencies or what their competitive advantages are. And then they say, okay, based on this, let's create something and see how we can then get customers to buy this. That's a push strategy. And that's much, much harder than a pull strategy where you actually figure out what is it that customers need? What is it that they want? What will solve their problems? And then you come back and see how you can create, communicate, and deliver it. Okay, so that was an important point I wanted to make. With that done, let me just say, so why is it that if this is so obvious, firms lose customer focus? I haven't met a single CEO, I haven't heard of a single company that will say that it's not customer focused. There isn't a firm out there, there isn't an organization out there that will claim that it's not customer focused. And I know, from my experiences, and I'm sure from your own experiences, there are lots of firms and lots of organizations that are not at all customer focused. They're very customer unfocused. So what is this reason? Why this mismatch? And there are lots of reasons, actually. In the interest of time, I'll just share one with you. And so think about Kodak, right? If you think about what business was Kodak in, what was Kodak's value proposition? What was the underlying need that Kodak was trying to meet for their customers? So again, if we take a minute and we pause and we think about this, and I'm going to give you a minute, we take a pause and I want you to think about this, and then I'll give you the answer. What business do you think Kodak was in? What fundamental need of the customer do you think Kodak was trying to meet? So if you think about this, in fact, there's a hint that comes from a Kodak ad. There used to be an old Kodak ad which would talk about the Kodak moment. And so when you think about the Kodak moment, what do you think of? You think about creating a memory. And that was really the fundamental need that Kodak was trying to meet. It was helping its customers, the users of its products, to create, share, and store memories. And the moment I say that, it's obvious to you that who were Kodak's competitors? Well, initially there were other photographic companies, right? So Fuji and Nikon and Canon. But with the change in technology, with the change in consumer behaviors, their competitors did not just remain companies that were in the photographic industry. Their competitors became anything and everything you could use to create, share, or store your memories. So most people now, we use our phones to take pictures. We use all kinds of online services to share these pictures. And we use all kinds of storage, cloud storage, to store these pictures. So our ways of creating, sharing, and storing memories has completely transformed itself. And so it's no surprise that a firm like Kodak is now completely obsolete and outdated. They don't even exist. They hardly exist anymore. They are not the firm that they used to be. And so again, the irony here is that a part of Kodak was aware of this. They could see this future coming. In fact, they were operating in this future. They were also creating digital cameras and digital methods of taking and sharing and storing photographs. But the part of the company that was driven, that brought in the most of the revenue and then was focused on not cannibalizing itself, that part of the company was driving most of the decision making, because they, had the majority of the revenues that they were bringing in. They were financing the company, so they had a bigger say in what the company did, and that led to its demise. This lack of customer focus, this lack of understanding where consumers and technology and the interplay of these was going, and because they really didn't understand the nature, again, this is the irony, they didn't really understand how the nature of their own business was changing. And so the basic point here is that markets evolve routinely, but firms and managers find it hard to adapt. And this is just human nature. We tend to look inwards, we tend to think about what we think of as defining what the world should be like. But that's not the way it is. And so we have to stay customer focused routinely, depending on the kind of business we are in. If the business is a fast changing business, things change really quickly, we have to keep a much careful eye on customers and a more frequent eye on our customers. Whereas if you're in a business that changes more gradually, changes more slowly, then we can sometimes take our eye off the customer and don't have to keep trying to understand what the customer trends are on that frequent a basis, but we still need to follow and keep an eye on the customer. So with that said, let's now talk about how do we actually implement customer focus? How do we actually do this? And that is all about the customer journey. So let me now talk about the customer journey. A customer journey, just to give you a quick preview, the customer journey is really about helping us do a number of things, but I'll highlight 3 of these. So 3 of these are, it'll help us identify opportunities or need gaps for innovation. It'll help us to diagnose weaknesses or pain points to help increase adoption. And it'll help us to enhance the user experience to sustain continued usage or loyalty. So these are 3 advantages of thinking about the customer journey. So let me begin with a little exercise. You can pick any of these 3 products. So pick a product, for you to think about. Other people in the webinar can be thinking about the other products. So some of you might be thinking about product A, and I'll tell you how to think about it. I'll give you the little exercise on the next slide. So if you're thinking about product A, it's typically going to be a mundane product that costs less than £5, and then you can translate £5 into your local currency. If you want to choose to think about a product like product B, then you're thinking about a product that is utilitarian. So it's primarily a functional product. It meets a functional need for you, but it's relatively expensive. It costs more than £100. And on the other hand, if you're thinking about a product like product C, now you're thinking about a relatively expensive product. So again, costs more than £100, but is primarily hedonic. That means it's ego expressive or self-expressive. It's something that makes you happy. So pick one of these 3 products, and then you could be thinking about questions like the following. You could be thinking about who is the decision-making unit. So how did you make the decision whether to buy this product or not? You could be thinking about what motivated the purchase. So what was the reason you bought this product? You could be thinking about, was it a first-time decision, a review of a previous decision? Was it a careful decision, or was it a casual decision? You could be thinking about Was there any information search? How was the search done? How much information was collected? What sources of information were used? You could be thinking about that. You could be thinking about, where did you buy this product? Why did you buy it there? Which came first, whether to buy or what to buy? You could be thinking about, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the product or service? Did the product exceed or fall short of your expectations? So these are the kind of things I want you to think about. So I'll give you a minute to think about these, and then we'll discuss and we'll debrief this. So I'm just going to give you about a minute to think about this. And as I said, you just need to be doing this for one of these 3 products. You don't have to do it for all 3. Just do it for one of them. Okay, if you've had a chance to think about this, then for those of you who thought about a product like product B, so a utilitarian product that is relatively expensive. So maybe you were buying something like a vacuum cleaner, say. Right? So if you were buying a vacuum cleaner, which is not something that you buy frequently, you don't buy it, every 6 months, you probably don't even buy it every year. You buy it every few years, something like that. It's a relatively expensive product. And so because of that, when you start thinking about it, it does occupy a certain amount of your thought process. It's a high involvement product. So it's a high involvement purchase, sorry, not a high involvement product. It's a high involvement purchase. That means it's a relatively expensive thing. So you want to actually spend some time thinking about this. And so when you make a purchase like this, there's typically a process that you go through. There's a customer journey, and it begins with need recognition. So you recognize that there's a need to replace or to buy a new vacuum cleaner, maybe because you've just moved house or your old one broke, or again, the old one wasn't functioning as well. You need some new capabilities because there's been some change of some form in your house or your household. So there's a process of need recognition. Then there's a process of information search. You can either talk to your friends or colleagues, or you might search online, read online reviews. You might actually go out and visit some stores, try out a few of these vacuum cleaners. So different ways you might search for information. You evaluate the alternatives, and then you make a choice that either you're going to buy or you're not going to buy. And if you're going to buy, which one you're going to buy, where are you going to buy it from, the price point, you compare prices, all kinds of things. You make the choice after evaluating alternatives. And then there's a post-purchase aspect. Either you're happy with it or you're unhappy. If you're unhappy, if you have a warranty, maybe you return it. Or, if you're really happy, you might even post online. You might post a review yourself. If you're unhappy, you might post a negative review. So there's the post-purchase aspect. So this is typically that happens with high involvement purchases. Now, if you're buying something like product A, which is a relatively mundane product, relatively inexpensive, which is a low involvement purchase. So this could be like a cup of coffee that you drink every morning on your way to work. You actually skip a bunch of steps. There's need recognition. So every morning I'm on my way to work. I need a cup of coffee. That's the need recognition. But I don't have to go through information search. I don't have to figure out what exactly, whether I want coffee or tea or some other beverage. I pretty much have a good idea what I want. I know where I'll get it. And I just skip a bunch of steps and I go from need recognition to choice. And then post-purchase, I come back again the next morning and, buy that cup of coffee. So you can see this is a low involvement purchase. Now, the interesting thing is that, as I said, low involvement and high involvement, that depends pretty much on the consumer. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. I'm using a technical term, heterogeneity. There's differences in how consumers approach this. So it could be you, the coffee drinker, want your morning coffee, but you're traveling on business. You are in a different town. In that case, you actually have to go through a number of these steps, because even though you have need recognition, even though you have a pretty good idea of what kind of coffee you want, you don't know where it's available. And you don't even know if it's available at 2 different stores. Is one store better at this than the other store? So you have to go through some of these steps, right? So this low involvement purchase becomes a slightly more high involvement purchase in that context. Then on the other hand, there are people who are coffee aficionados, right? They like literally spend a bunch of their lives, a bunch of their time trying to drink great coffee. And so they are going through this process, in fact, the full-blown customer search with all these steps quite frequently, right? Because they're exploring and they're trying to find great coffee in different places. And so they're going through this process repeatedly. You could also imagine someone with the vacuum cleaner, someone who has a really, really busy life. Their vacuum cleaner broke. They don't want to spend time looking for it. They're relatively wealthy, so they not that price sensitive. And they might just go online to Amazon and say, which is the most popular vacuum cleaner, and just buy that. Or just based on an ad they saw for a vacuum cleaner, for example, they might have heard of Dyson, which is the bladeless technology, and they say, let me just try that. Right? So for them, even a vacuum cleaner might become a relatively low involvement purchase where they've skipped through a bunch of steps. And this is one of the great challenges, that the customer journey depends on not just the product or service, how you position the product or service, but it also depends on the segment of customers it attracts. Which are the greatest segments that are buying your product or service? And then, of course, if you were thinking about a product like product C, which was a relatively expensive product, but primarily self-expressive or ego-expressive, something that you indulge in that case, this whole customer journey goes out of the window, right? It's you buy the thing and then you rationalize it, right? You don't go through this whole process to buy the thing. You just say, I want to buy this. I just want to please myself. I want to treat myself. I deserve this. I want to indulge myself, and therefore you buy it, right? And this process, this customer journey is, essentially this process as part of the customer journey goes out of the window. It's a very different kind of customer journey. So the important things to take away are that the customer journey is not just about how you position the product, but the kind of customers you will attract. And so your hope always is that if you position it in the right way, you will attract the kind of customers that you best match with, whom your customer experience is designed to fit well, their customer journeys. So that's what you're trying to do. So as I begin to wrap up now, let me remind you about a couple of things. So, what has been the big change in the customer journey? So it used to be that the customer journey was driven by, things that we were familiar with in the 20th century. There was TV, there were classifieds, there was the yellow pages, there were the paper versions of consumer reports, and then there was word of mouth. What has happened now is that the customer journey has changed, basically because consumer behavior has changed. So need recognition is happening a lot more online. Information search is certainly happening online. People compare alternatives using online reviews a lot. Purchase very often happens online. And then post-purchase, a lot of this happens online. So it's not that word of mouth is new. In fact, just like the little picture I showed you on the previous slide, we always spoke to people, right? And we still speak to people. So word of mouth still happens in person. In fact, that's often the best word of mouth, even today. Again, that's another irony, right? That we live in this online age, this digital age, where there's so much information online that we don't even know what information to trust. So in fact, word of mouth has become the most sacred, so actual word of mouth, physical word of mouth, person-to-person word of mouth has actually become the most sacred form of information, right? We trust that way more. We trust because we trust those people. We know them. So we trust them more than what we might read online, right? So if our family members or friends tell us something, that's more valuable information. It is more credible information than stuff that we read online, because there's so much information online, we can't tell fact from fiction. But the customer journey has changed, right? For most things, for most products. And so a great example of this is food, right? So if you think about food, food is a completely physical product, right? No amounts of bits or bytes are going to be able to feed your hunger or to help you with your thirst. So when you're hungry, you need actual physical food. But if you run a restaurant, so if your business is serving food, running a restaurant, should you think about the digital world, because you're actually operating in a very physical world in one sense. But if you think about a customer's journey, need recognition is very physical. You get hungry or you get thirsty. But a lot of information search happens online. Alternative evaluation happens online. The purchase very often happens online, and then the delivery is online, and the post-purchase, if you're happy with the food or unhappy with the food that you got, also happens online. So even if you're a restaurant, because your customers have changed how they come to you and how they purchase from you and how they react in the post-purchase stage, so essentially their customer journey has changed, you have to be thinking about the digital domain, right? So it's certainly important to have a good chef, to have good recipes, to have a clean, hygienic kitchen, so that the food inspectors will give you a high grade. It's certainly important to have a good decor if you serve your food within your premises. But it's also important to be thinking about a website. Have a website that's nice, aesthetically pleasing, elegant, easy to order from. It's also important to be thinking about distribution of your online orders. Do you have a delivery service? What kind of a delivery service do you have? Is it in-house or is it outsourced? So even if you're a restaurant owner, it's become really important to think about the digital domain. And this is true for a lot of other products and services. So think about flying, traveling from place A to place B. We just haven't reached that stage. I wish it was the case that we could say to Scotty, like in Star Trek, Scotty, beam me up. It would save us the whole hassle of going to the airport and going through security and all that kind of stuff, and then getting onto a plane, and then then losing our bags, and then us having to sort of find our bags again. It would save us all that trouble, right? But we haven't reached that place. So even though getting from place A to place B, flying from place A to place B is a completely physical process where they have to put you into an aluminum tube and then get you up about 30 or 40,000 feet in the air and then bring you down safely. The customer journey is really online. We pretty much search for itineraries online. We buy tickets online. We just show up at the airport. We get transported from place A to place B. And then, in fact, even if our bags are lost, we hardly ever speak to a person. Everything happens online. They just text us, or they just email us and say where our bags are and when they will be sent to our location, wherever we might be. So even in that completely physical context, the customer journey has become a digitized journey. And that's why it's important to think about the digital domain and to think carefully about where our customers are going, because that's going to define what we want to do. Now, as I conclude, let me just say one thing. Why are we breaking this journey down into stages? It's because if we can break it down into stages, then it helps us to think what the potential need gaps or pain points might be, and then help us innovate and create better value propositions. And that's why I began with the idea of the value proposition. It's all about creating superior value propositions that have pull rather than that have to be pushed. And so let me give you some examples of great business ideas that have come out of these different stages of the customer journey. Need recognition. So we all know that we tend to overuse our toothbrushes, and Oral-B, felt this was something that was limiting their sales. So they introduced this really small innovation. They introduced these blue bristles in between the white bristles. And the idea was that the blue bristles would wear out faster than the white bristles. So when the blue bristles wore out, the consumer would be alerted that, hey, time to change your toothbrush, right? And that increased that demand. Amazon, you can go back and think about 20 years ago when Amazon was starting as a new business, or 25 years ago when they were starting as a new business. They could have said, why should we have online reviews? Why should we have a search function? People can search elsewhere. They can search on search engines. If we have online reviews, people might post negative reviews, which would cut into our sales. But they actually went with both these functions, and that has helped them so much, right? So a lot of times if you're buying, that's the example I just gave you, right? That the vacuum cleaner. A lot of times people will just go onto Amazon and see what's the most popular product on Amazon, or which product has the most reviews or the best reviews, right? And because it's actually reviews by verified purchasers or verified users, those reviews actually have more credibility attached to them than if it's an anonymous review on some anonymous website, right? If you think about the ordering process, right, this was Dell's basic business model. So Michael Dell was an undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin. He's sitting in his dorms and he's thinking, how do I cut the middleman out? And he says, what if we deliver directly to the consumer? So direct to consumer. If I deliver directly to the consumer pays a lower price. I don't have to pay a commission to the middleman. I can do just in time. I can have products manufactured by my manufacturers once the order has actually been placed by the consumer. So I don't even have storage or inventory costs. So it's a win-win-win for everyone, right? And that's his basic business model. Payment. Amazon for a while had patented the one-click payment system, right? No other website could have a one-click payment system. Of course, the patent is expired, but that made the whole process of payment and choice much easier, right? Consumption. This is another idea. It's an old idea. Maybe it's an old idea in new bottles. Apologize for the pun. But for the longest time, Coke was way ahead of the game in terms of market share compared to Pepsi, at least in the US. Till Pepsi came up with a very small innovation. Instead of just selling their soda in small bottles or cans, they started selling it in 2-liter bottles. And if people were buying 2-liter bottles and storing larger bottles in their refrigerators, then they were drinking more Pepsi as well. So Pepsi's sales went up and they caught up with Coke. Now, of course, there's no secret to this. There's no entry barrier to this. If Pepsi can create a 2-liter bottle, so can Coke and so can all the other soda manufacturers. But certainly at that stage, this little innovation helped them catch up on market share, right? It helped get people to try more Pepsi, to drink more Pepsi, and become more familiar with Pepsi, and help them catch up with Coke. And then even post-purchase, right? So Evian is just an example, but a lot of other firms do this too. They think about, especially as we live in this age of where people are concerned about environmental change and climate emergency and sustainability and all those kinds of issues, firms that are able to think post-purchase. This is just an example. So if you are selling your products in packaging that is more environmentally friendly or sustainable or biodegradable, then there are people who will buy a product. There is a segment of customers who will actually are willing to pay more to buy a product, right? And so you can also think about post-purchase, and that might also be a place where you can innovate. Okay, so this is the rationale behind thinking of this customer journey in these different kinds of steps. So let me conclude. We're running out of time. Let me conclude, and then we can see if we have time for a question or two. What you really want to do always is begin by asking, do we really have a superior value proposition? Always remember, things begin with the customer, and we have to be careful about thinking about the customer and be customer focused. And so it's always about thinking outside in and not inside out. And this is because the value in the value proposition comes from our customers. How do we get into our customer's shoes? How do we actually develop customer empathy? Well, it's about thinking about the customer journey carefully. And that has implications for firm strategy and execution. It can help us identify opportunities or need gaps for innovation. It can help us diagnose weaknesses or pain points to help increase adoption. It can help us enhance the user experience to sustain continued usage or develop loyalty. Finally, I'd like to say two things. One is that these frameworks apply in different contexts. So they apply in for-profit contexts, They're equally relevant in not-for-profit, they're relevant in B2C, B2B, emerging markets, mature markets. Now, we obviously, in the interest of time, we haven't had a chance to explore all these different contexts, but these apply. Lastly, I would say practice is the key to understanding and succeeding with these frameworks. Just like you cannot learn how to play golf just by reading the golf, the USGA, the United States Golf Association rules, or you cannot learn how to play an instrument just by reading a book. You actually have to practice it. I would recommend highly, I would suggest highly that you practice these frameworks, try these out in your careers, in your businesses. And that's, there'll be a process of trial and error. You won't succeed right away. It'll be a challenge to apply these, but that's how you will learn and that's how you will grow. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'll stop sharing my slides, and we'll see, given the glitch that we had with the video, we'll see if we can take any questions. I'm happy to take a question or two before we stop. Okay, so let me stop sharing the slides and let me go back. Okay, Abhijit, do we have some sort of a chat box or something to see the questions? I'm trying to see. Okay, here I saw it. Okay,
yes,
so okay, so we have 2 questions. I'll try and answer these the best I can in the time we have. So Adarsh is asking me, what according to you is the value proposition of Apple, because their products are always way more expensive than competitors who offer similar or better products? Right, Adarsh, that's a very interesting question, and we could actually spend an hour talking about this, or maybe even more than an hour. But to briefly, Apple has, and actually I'm going to talk a little bit about this when I do the next webinar. So a couple of weeks from now, when we talk about branding and positioning, we'll actually spend more time talking about Apple's branding and positioning. And so Apple is not just about product features, and we'll come back to this in the next webinar. So this is a segue into that. Apple's value proposition is much, much broader. So exactly like you point out, there are lots of other firms that in fact have superior products and actually cheaper products. And so a lot of it is about Apple's cachet. Their value is in their values. They espouse a sense of values that appeal to a segment of customers, and not all customers will actually buy an Apple. So I had a very interesting experience. I was teaching this program, and I had a student in there, and we were talking about Apple. We were actually talking about, I was asking different people what they felt about Apple, and so this guy said that he used to own an Apple phone, but when it came time to upgrade his phone, he felt that the Apple products were way overpriced. And so he said that, I always think very rationally. I'm not driven by emotional kinds of decisions. I think very rationally. And so thinking rationally, I thought Apple's products were overpriced. And I could actually find products that were as good as Apple's or better than Apple's at a lower price point. And in fact, he gave me the example, I think, either said Huawei or some other brand, Asian brand. So he bought that, and he said, I saved about 800 euros when I did this. And then what I did was that I said, I also recognize, but there are people who actually really like the Apple brand. It appeals to them because of all these other things, these emotional things. So I took the 800 euros and I actually bought Apple stock with that, right? So, it's basically there are different kinds of customers, some people who sort of see value in the Apple brand, and they see it for different reasons. It's not just about products and features. And then there are some very rational people who sort of evaluate things in a very rational way, and they don't see value in the Apple product. But Apple's is really not going for the rational people. They're going for the people who espouse the same values that they do. And we can talk about what those values are when we talk about branding and positioning, and I'll take the Apple example at that stage. So just wait a couple of weeks. Okay, Srinath asks me this question: how would one balance strategy between firm objective, working for the boss, versus customer focus working? Srinath, you asked almost an existential question. We could have a philosophical discussion about this and go on for hours about this. What you've got to do, basic short answer, you've got to get the boss to see that it's all about the customer, because even the boss's salary is paid for by the customer. If you did not have the customers, your boss wouldn't have a salary, your boss wouldn't have a job. So forget about you, even your boss wouldn't have a salary, your boss would not have a job. So the trick is to get your boss gently, to get your boss to understand that it's really all about the customer. It's not about them. And I know this is much, much harder said than done. This is not easy to do. This is a problem that afflicts, I would say, every organization. There's a boss like this, or there are many bosses like this in every organization. And they actually, I think what they do is they actually harm the organization. They are really detrimental to the organization because they bring a sense of, it's a lack of humility. It's a lack of understanding. It's a lack of appreciation what this is all about. It is all about the customer. And then when I say all about the customer, I don't mean that you need to suck up to the customer. I'm not saying you lose your dignity or lose your respect, but you have to decide what your value proposition is and which are the customers you want to work with. And I emphasize the word work with. It's a partnership. It's a relationship. And so it's not about losing your respect or losing your sense of self-worth or anything. You don't have to suck up to your customers. You have to work with them. It's a relationship. It's a two-way relationship. So you have to respect them just the way they have to respect you. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to, as I said, create, communicate, and deliver value to your customers. So everything comes from the customer, right? As I said, that the CEO of Home Depot used to say, the customer pays our salary. And so that's what this is about. So this is very hard. In fact, this, Srinath, what you're asking me goes outside marketing. We're actually not talking about general business principles, organizational behavior and things like that, and business philosophy. And we could have a much longer discussion on this. Unfortunately, we don't have the time for that. Prashant is asking, how important is social listening when we speak about understanding customers today? Yes, Prashant, this is very important. The question is, when do you do the social listening? And your question will be better answered by my colleague, Sasha Liu. So when Professor Liu does her session, she will talk about when and where and how to listen. It's not just social listening. It's when you do it, how you do it, and where you do it. Do you do it on Twitter or do you do it on Facebook? When do you seed content yourself to get customers to feedback and tell you about what they're thinking? So these are important questions, and she will talk more about this. But in one sense, more broadly speaking, it's not just about social listening in the sense of online listening. This is what I just said a little while ago. It's about when you're trying to understand customers and develop your value propositions, one short way to think about this is how incremental or radical is your innovation going to be. When it's going to be more incremental, then you actually talk to your customers in a different way. And when I say a different way, I mean that you actually talk to them and ask them for suggestions because they have experience, they can tell you, and they can be pretty helpful with incremental innovation, right? So if I say it's not that I'm introducing a completely new technology, but I want to improve the kind of experience you have with your smartphone. And then customers can tell you, I like a larger screen or a smaller screen. I like a keyboard or I don't like a keyboard. Do I like to be able to do, functions X, Y, and Z at the same time? That kind of stuff they can tell you, right? So that's incremental innovation. When you're trying to do more radical innovation at that stage, customers cannot even articulate what they want. Just imagine 40, 50, 60 years ago, if you went around and you asked people about cashless currency, right? Getting people to go cashless and do transactions in a cashless way. No one could have thought about that. They didn't even they wouldn't have been aware that this was possible. Just like about 100 years ago, if you ask people about credit cards, plastic was something we thought was disposable. It was like, valueless. And now some of the most valuable things that we carry in our pockets are actually plastic, right? Our credit cards that have high credit value on them. And so, people had this need that they didn't want to carry cash around. But about 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, time of our grandparents, they couldn't have suggested that the way to do this, the way to get around the need to carry cash was to put value onto plastic. and then carry a piece of plastic in your pocket. Someone came up with that idea, but that was not, I don't think that was actually a suggestion that came from a consumer. That was someone thinking about what was the kind of experience they wanted to deliver, what was the need gap, what was the pain point, and then, putting things together and saying, okay, we have the technology now to actually put value on plastic. And that will save people the trouble of having to carry cash. Just like now that we've gone from plastic to actually bits and bytes. Now we carry value on our phones on bits and bytes, right? And that's the new, in fact, the example is the new Apple credit card, right? So anyway, so hopefully that answers your question. So it's been my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Hope you've enjoyed the webinar and hope you have a great rest of the day and the rest of the weekend, wherever you might be. So once again, my greetings to you from Cambridge, and so long, and I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. All right, thank you very much. Abhijit, you want to wrap up?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for taking time out today, and thank you, everyone. Before everyone leaves, just make sure that you fill the feedback that is on your screens right now. And all in all, thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. For anyone who hasn't filled the feedback till now, please fill the feedback and then you can leave.